Metric 3 focuses on activities considered shoreline restoration, but also may include activities done in other wetland habitats. The approved activity types include reef construction, reef preparation, planting native wetland vegetation, and wetland vegetation management. Both activities of reef preparation and wetland vegetation management only require the universal metric of photo monitoring. Reef preparation is a slew of different activities, ranging from recycling oyster shells to actually packaging those shells into a shell bag to be placed on a reef. Gulf Corps also has a project in Louisiana where crews bundle Christmas trees and recycle those to create a reef. So that is also considered reef preparation work. Under wetland vegetation management, again, this is a broad category covering any type of preparation work you would do for wetland vegetation that is intended to be planted or grown later on. This may include collecting seeds for later propagation, such as the photo in the bottom right of pitcher plant seeds, or this may be working at a nursery and tending to plants that you are growing to later be planted along a shoreline. And so along with the universal photo monitoring, we do ask you to include some numerical data about this work that you do. So in the narrative that you'll place into the Smartsheet reporting sheets, you'll want to report the number of plants grown or the ounces of seeds collected, for example, for wetland vegetation management. Or if you're doing reef preparation, you'll want to note the number of shell bags or trees bundled or pounds of oysters recycled, and so forth. Both constructing reefs and planting native wetland vegetation can sometimes fall under the term of living shoreline. These activities often require a permit to be completed, and so for the monitoring activities for reef construction, these are just examples that we encourage folks to use and talk to their partners with, but there is going to be a large variety of monitoring across these projects. From our experience, this is what we have noticed is collected across the Gulf states, and that includes subcodes 3.1 and then 3.3 through 3.6. Again, just covering the spatial extent and then the numerical data. And as always, you'd also want to include photo monitoring for this type of activity. To gather the spatial extent of a reef, if it's a shoreline reef, you should be able to just walk the perimeter around the multiple reef segments, making sure to also include the gaps that are between them. If you're doing that project in Louisiana, you may be able to be in an airboat like this picture and have a GPS tracking where you go, but if that's not the case, again, this is most likely going to be a project that has a lot of permitting, working with partners, and they should be able to provide you the project spatial extent. The first section of the reef and oyster monitoring data sheet includes an area for you to include reef details, specifically the length, width, and average height across the reef. So whether you're doing a tree bundle or actually putting a reef onto the sea floor, you're going to want to get those measurements. For the second half of this data sheet, focusing on oyster monitoring, and again, this is only going to be specific with your project partners if this is a goal of their project. We're going to monitor the live oyster density as well as the size frequency. So you can hear we're going to get that percent oyster coverage within a quadrat, as well as identify if it's an adult, juvenile, spat, or dead. And you can see below the note section here what that means in centimeters. Next, for the activity of planting native wetland vegetation, again, if this is along a shoreline, you most likely are going to be working with a partner under a permit. So the monitoring for this might change, but this is what we are asking you to include is, of course, photo monitoring, and then the spatial extent and the density and height of planted vegetation, just like we do for when we plant upland vegetation. You can see in the images on the slide, most of the time you're going to do this method of density and height using a belt transect. If you want to review the approach of a belt transect, you can look at the invasive species monitoring video. Looking at the data sheet for wetland planting, it's going to look very similar to that of invasive species because, again, we are asking you to do a belt transect. So you're going to want to know the total length of the transect and number of quadrats for that transect. And that's something you'll hopefully have planned beforehand so you're ready to go when you get out there. For the latitude and longitude, you can randomly place these points and walk out to them when you get there. For a lot of these projects, the acreage is much smaller, and so the project partner may ask you to just do a transect, for example, every 25 meters. So that's, again, something you'll want to talk to your partner with, and you can place that on the pre-restoration worksheet so you know how many transects that you're going to be doing. Underneath the quadrats section, you'll see it has species, density, and then the average height of the plants. And so there's multiple sections for species on here. Even if you're not planting more than one species, the partner may ask you to note the height of other vegetation in the area. And as always, it's great to put information in the quadrat note section. You can see here there's some examples you might want to include, such as invasive species seen, terrestrial or marine organism seen, sediment type, and qualitative observations. Qualitative observations, you may see some erosion occurring, or for marine organisms or terrestrial organisms, you might see more wildlife a year or so as the project goes on and the plants start to take over. And that can really let the project partner and us at Gulf Corps know that the restoration is doing what we wanted it to do.